Good afternoon. Thank you for that excellent presentation. And I have the honor of introducing our next Grand Round speaker, Dr. Farr. Dr. Farr completed a bachelor's here at the University of Arizona, went on to do medical school here at the University of Arizona College of Medicine in Tucson. Her clinical interests include consult liaison psychiatry, perinatal and women's mental health, integrative medicine, as well as interventional psychiatry. She is a self-proclaimed child of the forest and avid eco-enthusiast, and will be presenting on the impact of nature on our mental health.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here, sticking with us. This is my grand rounds. Let's see if I'll keep moving down. Well, it's fine. So my grand rounds, I titled it Touch Grass. This will really be a brief whirlwind tour of nature and mental health. There's a lot that I could cover, but I'm going to try and give maybe a little surface level, but some interesting stuff that we'll talk about today. And one of the facts that I learned that I thought might be a good way to start this talk is that Americans spend about 93% of their lives indoors, which I thought was kind of mind-blowing if you think about. That's such a huge portion of our lives. We'll keep that in mind as we're thinking about our patients and what that might mean for ourselves, our patients, as we go through this talk. And then my last little plug here I'll give for my presentation. By the end of this, just by viewing the slides, which I have very specifically designed, we'll all be a bit more attentive, less stressed, more creative, and feel a bit more generally well, if for nothing else than the placebo, because I just said we would be. So I have no disclosures. And in terms of objectives, here's where we'll go with things today. We're going to look at some current literature and explore what is out there between, or the connections between green space and mental health. We'll also look at some of the pathways, what might drive some of these connections, and then look at more practical applications and see what this might mean for our patients, ourselves, our environments. And in terms of how we're going to do that, we're going to start with the what and the why. The what being what actually are the connections, what do we know? The why being why is this important? Why did I make a grand rounds about this? And the how being the connections, and then practical applications. We'll get into those a little bit. So I wanted to set the stage a little bit before I spew, pun intended, of course. Nature is very intuitively good for us. I think everyone probably knew that without me giving a 25-minute talk on nature being good for us. And this is not a new notion. This is as pretty much as old as time. When I went back, there's many, many, many civilizations who have had this idea that nature is good for us. There was Hippocrates back in his day, had this ancient Greek phrase, which I'm totally going to butcher, vis medicatrix naturae, which means the healing power of nature. There was also Cyrus the Great back in old times in Persia, who made gardens in his urban cities to increase the health and wellness of his people. There was a 16th century Swiss German physician who had a really nice quote here: "The art of healing comes from nature, not from the physician." So this is a very well-known notion, but as I was looking more into that, that really got me thinking about, if it's so well known, why don't we use it? Why is this not a part of modern psychiatry? And the best explanation that I have at this point is, we're in this post-industrialized world. There's a move towards urbanization. We're getting a little bit cut off more from nature. And we'll kind of explore why that might not be the best thing for us. And then the last point I wanted to make here is that although this is a very intuitive concept, and research is a little bit behind in my opinion. So you don't have a lot of your like gold standard RCTs with huge effect sizes and large significance. A lot of the research is in that moderate to low category. There's a few that do hit that gold standard, but by and large, the research is maybe a little bit behind what we already intuitively know. And not to say that there aren't any really interesting, very inventive studies out there, but more so to set the stage that I'm hoping more research will help reinforce these concepts. And then I'll mention too that this is a huge category. Nature is a ginormous thing to tackle in 25 minutes. So I have very, very consciously narrowed my focus to green spaces. And there's this concept of blue spaces, which is probably self-explanatory, but blue meaning oceans, bodies of water, green meaning plants, trees, lichen, mosses, grasses, that kind of thing. And as I was also looking at that distinction, it got me thinking about our Tucson desert because it doesn't quite fit into some of those categories. And there's still a lot of beautiful nature here that we interact with that has a positive effect on us. So I saw one paper that was suggesting the term brown spaces, which I just don't love. I think we can do better than that. So for now, we'll focus on green spaces and see what the research tells us. And we're going to start with the what and the where first. Okay, so looking first at childhood, we'll go through this chronologically. Even at the very beginning, we know that higher nature exposure is associated with better birth outcomes. So they looked at preterm birth, low birth weight, and small first gestational age, and they found that those were all improved when moms and babies have better exposure to nature. They also found that there was better early childhood neurodevelopment, and that's both cognitive and motor, that was improved with better exposure to nature. Kids tend to perform better on attention scores when they have more nature, and they exercise more. This was a really interesting study that looked at kids who spend at least 20 minutes a day in nature exercise 5 times as much as their counterparts who spend 0 minutes a day in nature. And then in terms of depression, that's also decreased, and specifically the incidence of depression as well as the severity of depression in childhood is decreased. Autism was another really interesting one. They looked at schools in California, elementary schools that had greenery around them, and they found that there was a 10 to 19% reduction in autism, which is kind of staggering. And then benefits of childhood exposure to nature also extend to adulthood. So we see less substance use, mood, psychotic anxiety, personality, eating disorders. That's like 5 or 6 huge categories I just mentioned that are all decreased across the board. And even schizophrenia as well. They looked at people who are in the lowest section of exposure to nature, and they found that there was a 1.5-fold increase in rates of schizophrenia for that group. So it seems to have a protective effect for many things. And looking at adulthood here too, I didn't feel like I could give this talk without briefly mentioning some of the physical benefits aside from the mental health because they are so interconnected. So I'm going to mention these briefly, but this could be a whole other grand rounds at another time. Blood pressure, improved sleep, cardiovascular health is improved. There's even an inverse relationship with mortality when people have more nature in their lives. And that was studied across, I think, 7 or 8 different nations that they looked at. And then this idea of improved immune function, we'll touch on that later. But just to set the stage that there are many physical health benefits in addition to mental health. And now looking at some of those mental health benefits. So nature has a protective effect on depression. And there have been a couple studies who looked at this specifically, looked at Americans. There was decreased depression associated with higher time outdoors. There was a study even that looked at, I think, almost 100,000 people in the UK. And they found that with each higher segment that they had measured people of nature exposure, there was a 4% decrease every time. So it's almost like a dose-dependent relationship in a way. And stress is also very much associated with nature. We'll explore a bit more of the pathways there, but perceived stress as well as stress biomarkers like salivary cortisol, blood pressure, heart rate, those kind of things also tend to be inversely correlated. Biodiversity, I wanted to quickly mention here. So very important concept, which I won't spend a lot of time on, but there was a cool study that looked at bird abundance and correlated it with depression, anxiety, stress specifically, and found that the more bird abundance, the less these were present. And I mentioned that because I wanted to illustrate that point of biodiversity, and also I thought it'd be fun to say bird abundance during my grand rounds. In terms of social and spiritual benefits, I'll start with spiritual. The studies around spiritual benefits have been really interesting. They remind me a lot of early studies on psychedelic medicines, where there's almost this feel of finding the right verbiage to describe these experiences. They're qualitative in nature. One study even described transcendental experiences and how it might boost people's creativity being in nature. Social benefits as well. So nature provides or facilitates social interaction very much, and that's really important for us just as humans. So if we look at the biopsychosocial model of psychiatry, this ties in very, very well. Another point here I was going to make is, seems like there's an inverse relationship between nature and crime, which I did not expect to find when I was researching this grand rounds. There were two studies, one out of Philadelphia and one out of Ohio, where they took vacant lots and they randomized them to be either cleaned and greened or left the same. And what they found is when they had the lots that were cleaned and green, they found decreased crime rates. And they looked at gun assaults and robberies, burglaries, crime in general just decreased when they greened lots. So it seems like there's a correlation there as well. I'm looking next at this idea of elderhood. I don't know if that's a word, but I thought it would fit nicely into my schema here. We again see reduced incidence of psychiatric disorders, and that's depressive spectrum, anxious spectrum, psychotic spectrum, as well as neurocognitive disorders. And it does slow, it seems like nature exposure over your lifetime does slow cognitive decline. And I thought this was I keep saying this, but I thought this was particularly interesting as well. There was a reduced risk of and improvement in patients with dementia, especially in terms of hospital admissions for people who are diagnosed with dementia, when people have more nature at their fingertips. And lastly, I wanted to touch on this idea of salubrity, which mostly for Dr. Curry's benefit, because I figured he would love this word if he doesn't already know it. If you're like me and you didn't know what this meant until now, it's the idea of being health promoting. So the things I've talked about thus far have been disease reducing, but this is more so in the case of health promoting. So what does nature do for us? It turns out it does a lot. Specifically, psychological well-being. People report just feeling more well. There was a study that also looked at people wearing wearable devices and had them check in within exposures to nature and found that within about 10 minutes of being in nature, people report being happy, restored, or relaxed. There's also this idea of feeling more vitality or more vigor and engaging in more health promoting behaviors like exercise. So all across the board seems to be pretty good for us. And we'll look into why that might be the case next. Look at some pathways, starting with some neuroscience and neuroanatomy. I'll go through this graphic here in a second, but I'll start off with, there was a study where they looked at people who spent an hour walking in nature and an hour walking in urban environments. What they found is people who walked in nature had decreased amygdala activation versus the people in urban walking environments did not. So potential pathway that might explain some of these benefits that we've just been looking at. The other thing that I came across I thought was quite interesting here is decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, specifically in sub areas that are associated with rumination. I think that speaks, or that correlates quite well to some of the things that we've been talking about with anxiety, especially in depression. And then looking next at this graphic here, this came from a study out of Spain and Barcelona, where they looked at school children and they quantified their lifelong exposures to nature. And then they did a bunch of brain MRIs. And what they found in the yellow spots on the screen there, those are correlated with an increased exposure to greenness. So what they had kind of coined these greenness areas in the brain potentially. We see increased volume, specifically left premotor cortex, prefrontal cortex, and in the cerebellar hemispheres as well. And in this next graphic I have here, same study, Barcelona school children, but what they did is they mapped on areas that are significant to cognitive function specifically. So in the red, we can see those cognitive hubs where specifically working memory and attention are very important. And then the green areas, aptly named, are associated with greenness. And then the yellow is that overlap. So perhaps this could be part of the reason why, or part of how our brains respond to nature, which we can see some benefit in. And looking next at some theoretical frameworks, this is one that kept coming up when I was researching this topic a little bit more. Attention restoration theory, we'll go step by step through it. So the first concept of this is that attention is a resource. That means it's both exhaustible and replenishable. And when I mention attention, I'm specifically talking about that purposeful focusing attention, hopefully that we're all using right now as we're critically thinking about these slides. But it's that top-down idea. And the theory here is that nature affords us a particularly unique environment that switches us from this top-down to the bottom-up processing, and then allows that top-down attention-specific resource to replenish itself. The exact like how and why that nature might be that unique replenishing environment is a bit, I don't understand it fully well enough, but there are some theories around maybe our evolutionary, something to do with evolution in us and nature. And then I put self-regulation question mark here. This I thought was a good tie-in specifically with psychiatry. If attention is a resource and that can be exhausted, then self-regulation that is a part of that attentional resource could be potentially exhausted and replenished with nature as well. Self-regulation can be very important for many of the disorders that we treat on a daily basis. And this was another theory I saw come up. It's pretty self-explanatory, so I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but the idea being high and out of proportion or chronic stress is not good for us. And nature can reduce that stress, both physiological and psychological state of stress. So therefore, nature is good for us. Pretty self-explanatory, so I'll move on pretty quickly. All right, this was from a paper that I thought was quite interesting, looking at some of the pathways that might help us explore. I thought this was a nice way to visualize everything. So we have time in and around nature and how that might produce these sort of active ingredients that affect us in certain ways and cause these physiological and psychological states that then lead to the health outcomes that we have talked about a little bit in this talk. And one thing that I really wanted to make sure I talked on here was this idea of phytoncides. I promise, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Or another way to put that would be terpenes. And those are volatile compounds which come from both plants and trees. And those terpenes tend to infer benefit to plants. So they do things like thermoprotection or signaling or disease pest resistance, but they're also the things that make plants and trees smell certain ways or taste certain ways. So a good example of this is a terpene called alpha pinene, which comes from pine trees and makes them smell piney. Well, not surprisingly. They looked at this terpene alpha pinene specifically and found that it has actually an anxiolytic and hypnotic effect on people and tends to actually increase non-REM sleep in a way that's quite similar to benzodiazepines, even like zolpidem. So I bring that up to illustrate it's not just what we're seeing in nature or interacting with, it's also what we are breathing in or smelling or hearing even. So there's lots of different pathways. And then I also wanted to talk briefly here about Mycobacterium vaccae, and I did look up how to pronounce that, that is correct. But that usually Mycobacterium are not good news for doctors or patients because that's what makes TB or leprosy. But it seems like this Mycobacterium vaccae could be a different story, maybe one of the good guys. This specific mycobacterium is found ubiquitously in soil and some water sources. And they're doing a lot of early studies, mice models and early human studies around this immune regulating function, potentially of mycobacterium. They're even looking at it in conjunction with some vaccines and how that might help with vaccines. The reason I specifically wanted to mention this too is to bring up the idea of microbial exposures as another potential pathway. And looking at this old friends hypothesis, which had come up, the idea that we evolved with a huge microbiome and how the interaction with that microbiome can potentially affect us quite a bit. The last pathway I wanted to look at here is from that same author of this paper. They had theorized that perhaps the immune function is more central here than we had realized before. And some of these effects that we're seeing really do relate to immune function, which is affected by these active ingredients that we've talked about. There was one interesting study that I'll mention here. They took a group of men and women from a company and they sent them on a 2-day vacation to this nature area. And they had to engage in nature-focused activities like forest bathing, things like that. They measured their NK cell activity before, during, and then a month after, and found that the NK cell activity specifically was significantly more or significantly improved after this nature vacation. And of course, after any vacation, we're probably feeling a lot better anyway. So to control for that, they took the same group of people and then sent them on an urban vacation, had them engage in the same activities, walking, doing these whatever activities, but in urban landscapes. And they did not see the same effect with the NK cells. So perhaps there is something there to this immune function and how that might underpin a lot of these benefits that we're seeing. And then also mention here too that even just olfactory stimulation of tree smells can produce this effect with NK cells, which kind of blew my mind when I learned that. And next we'll move on to some practical applications. What can we do for ourselves and for our patients? So I really like this recommendation. This is a concrete thing I thought we could all take away from today. This idea of 120 minutes, and that is total per week, spending 120 minutes in nature, that's 2 hours. Doesn't have to be like 2 hours exercising, but just 2 hours being outdoors or being around nature, natural elements. The authors had taken a bunch of people with nature exposures and looked at their health benefits and plotted it all on a bell curve and found that this peak occurs right around that 2 hour mark. So that is something that we can give our patients too as a concrete recommendation. And it doesn't, like I said before, it doesn't have to be all at once, but a minimum 20-minute interval seems to be the correct recommendation here. Next, and I'll mention too with this, the authors had looked at the association between health and well-being and this 120 minutes and found that it was similar to the association between health and well-being and exercising, getting right amount of exercise. So to me, that speaks to the magnitude of what this could potentially do for us. And then looking at how do we approach this, a risk-benefit approach, as we always do. Some things to consider would be safety and health. So looking at safety first, in Tucson, my first thought here was our extreme heat in the summer. That might not be very conducive to being outdoors. And then with health too, we want to consider our patients with asthma, allergies, disabilities, phobias, things like that. Take that into consideration when you're talking about the risk benefits. But there are lots of ways to engage with nature, even if it's not being outdoors in a national park or something like that. We can consider virtual reality, which has been studied in terms of this genre of research. We could look at olfactory stimulation or bird abundance, bird sound, naturescapes, all those things are ways to engage with nature. I really like this concept of a nature period, or not period, pyramid. Same idea as a food pyramid, where you have your recommendations for your most frequent and then decreasing frequency as you go up. This is something I thought might be, I very much would like to have this printed and put in my office. I feel like it'd be a great thought-provoking way to engage patients on this topic. This comes from, I think it was a festival in 2018 celebrating public health and ecology called Shift RX. And I'll move on now to how can we bring this to ourselves. So everything I just talked about is true. That 120 minutes idea, that's still true for us. I'll also mention a few things here. Forest bathing, wanted to talk about that. That is a concept that again is very, very old, but was introduced in name, I think in 1982 by the Japanese government. And it's this idea of spending time, at least 15-minute sessions, like outside in forests, if those are available to you. When they looked at this, they've showed decreased levels of salivary cortisol, decreased pulse rate, decreased blood pressures. So it seems like this is also very good for us, very good for stress. There was a study that I found that I really liked where they took internal medicine residents and they had them engage in an hour session of forest bathing. And there were a few key elements of this intervention that it happened during business hours. So they weren't asking residents to do work outside of work. And it was what I'm guessing is that protected didactic time when residents didn't have clinical duty. So they were free to really engage with this intervention. And what they found when these residents went on this forest bathing trek, they had decreased burnout scores, decreased irritability, more mindfulness. The other thing I wanted to mention too is that this forest bathing intervention occurred at a botanical garden that was local to the residency, which I will plant a little seed that we also have a botanical garden that's local to us. And this is a pilot study that would be very easily reproduced at any residency, especially a psychiatry residency, if one were to want to do that. Next, I'll mention houseplants briefly. So they've looked at houseplants and found when you have live houseplants around, it tends to increase parasympathetic activity, decrease sympathetic activity. Seems like it induces physiological relaxation, or at the very least reduces stress. So something else to consider, but of course abide by your clinic and hospital rules, because you're not always allowed to bring plants. And my key takeaways here that I'll mention: number one, let's help our patients treat nature deficiency disorder. This was from a book, so all credit to the author who created this phrase, but I really liked it. Help them get their 120 minutes, and take your own vitamin N and see if there are ways that you can work that more into your life. And then this idea of pioneering eco-psychiatry. So when I went through the research for this talk, there's a lot out there on eco-psychology and even like eco-well-being, eco-health, things like that, but there's almost nothing on eco-psychiatry. So I'd really love for psychiatry to jump on the bandwagon here and get more involved. Right now, when you put the term eco-psychiatry into PubMed, you get about half of the articles are on the mental health impacts of tiger attacks in India, which is very important, and I don't want to discredit that at all. But I would really love to see more research, more effort of psychiatry in this world, because I think it truly could be pretty world-changing. And then lastly, I'll just remind all of us when we can to touch grass. And that's all.